It was just after 7:30 in the evening, Eastern Time, when the radar screens at U.S. Central Command registered something no one wanted to see. An American AH-64 Apache, one of the most heavily armed and heavily armored helicopters in the entire United States military, had gone down. Not on a training range, not over friendly soil. It went down in the black water of the Gulf of Oman, just off the edge of the most dangerous stretch of ocean on the planet, the Strait of Hormuz. 2 American soldiers were now somewhere in that water, in the dark, with the Iranian coastline close enough to see if the moon had been right. And for a few minutes, nobody outside a small circle of military planners knew if they were alive. This is the story of what happened next, and it is a story that United States Central Command itself has called a first. Not a first for this war. Not a first for this region. A first in the recorded history of American military rescue operations, because the answer to who saved those 2 men did not come from a helicopter. It did not come from a Navy ship steaming into harm's way. It came from a machine with no pilot, no crew, and no fear, built by a task force most Americans have never heard of, operating in some of the most contested water in the world. Before we get to that rescue, and before we get to what the President of the United States said about it less than 24 hours later, we need to back up. Because the story of this crash does not start on that Monday night. It starts weeks earlier with a fragile ceasefire that was already coming apart at the seams. To understand why an American attack helicopter was flying low over the Gulf of Oman after dark in the first place, you have to understand what the Strait of Hormuz actually is, and why the United States has been willing to put its most advanced aircraft directly into harm's way to keep it open. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow channel of water separating Iran from Oman and the United Arab Emirates. At its narrowest point, it is only about 21 miles wide, and the shipping lanes that oil tankers actually use are even tighter than that. Despite its size, it is one of the single most important pieces of geography on Earth. Roughly a fifth of all the oil consumed globally passes through that channel. Shut it down, and you do not just hurt one country's economy, you send a shockwave through the entire global energy market. Iran has known this for decades. And in the spring of 2026, following a war that erupted between Iran, Israel, and eventually the United States, Iran attempted to do exactly that. It moved to close the strait, laying mines, threatening commercial shipping, and unleashing what has become known as its so-called Mosquito Fleet, a swarm of small, fast attack boats designed not to win a conventional naval battle, but to overwhelm through sheer numbers and constant harassment. In response, the United States launched what would become a months-long campaign to keep the channel open. Beginning in March of 2026, American and Israeli air power went after Iranian naval assets, drone facilities, and the small boats trying to choke off the strait. The chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff at the time, General Dan Kane, stood at a Pentagon podium and told reporters that the U.S. military intended to, in his words, hunt and kill the vessels and weapons being used against the strait. Officials confirmed that hundreds of small boats and dozens of mine-laying vessels had already been targeted in that effort. This is where the Apache comes in. The AH-64 was built as a tank killer, designed during the Cold War to hunt Soviet armor from just above treetop level. But over the water of the Persian Gulf, its mission had shifted. It became something closer to a low-altitude guardian, flying dangerously close to the surface, hunting one-way attack drones and fast boats before they could reach commercial shipping or American vessels. Alongside it flew the A-10 Warthog, the famous tank-shaped jet built around a single enormous rotary cannon, brought in specifically to deal with the same small, fast, and numerous threats. By early June, a ceasefire had technically been in place since April, but calling it a ceasefire was, at best, generous. The truce had been fraying for weeks, and in the 36 hours before the Apache went down, it nearly collapsed entirely. According to reporting at the time, Iran fired missiles toward Israel that Sunday, in what was described as retaliation for Israeli strikes on Hezbollah targets in Beirut. Israel responded decisively the following day, striking targets in western and central Iran, reportedly including facilities tied to Iran's ballistic missile production. The fragile agreement that had quieted the region since April was, by Monday evening, hanging by a thread. That was the backdrop. That was the environment an American Apache crew was flying into on a routine patrol along the edge of the strait near the coast of Oman, doing the same job Apaches had been doing for weeks, watching for drones, watching for small boats, trying to reassure commercial shippers that it was safe enough to use one of the most important waterways on Earth. And then, at 7:33 p.m. Eastern Time on Monday, June 8th, it went down. What we know for certain comes directly from USD Central Command. In an official statement, CENTCOM confirmed that the Apache crashed into the water off the coast of Oman while conducting patrol operations, and that both crew members were recovered within approximately 2 hours, in stable condition, according to the military's own words. What caused that crash is where the story gets more complicated, and where we have to be very careful about the difference between what has been confirmed and what has been claimed. Less than a day after the incident, President Donald Trump posted on his social media platform that Iran had shot the helicopter down. His exact words were that he had just been informed by, quote, our great military, that Iranian forces shot down one of the nation's highly sophisticated Apache helicopters while it was patrolling over the Strait of Hormuz. He said both pilots were safe and uninjured, and added that the United States, in his words, must, of necessity, respond to this attack. That is a direct statement from the President of the United States, and it matters. But it is important to note that at the time this was said, U.S. Central Command itself had not publicly confirmed the cause of the crash. Officials told multiple outlets that the investigation into what actually happened was still ongoing. Some reporting at the time, including from the New York Times, indicated it was not yet clear whether the aircraft had suffered a mechanical failure or had in fact been brought down by hostile fire, possibly from an Iranian drone. So here is where we sit with the facts. The president said Iran shot the helicopter down, and the United States conducted retaliatory strikes in response to that assessment. At the same time, the investigation into the actual cause was still active, and independent confirmation of exactly what brought the aircraft down had not been fully established in the initial hours and days after the crash. Both of those things can be true at once, and a responsible accounting of this story has to hold both of them. There are reasons to take the possibility of hostile fire seriously. Helicopters are mechanically complex machines, and at low altitude over open water, they are also uniquely vulnerable. If the Apache had been actively engaging a fast attack boat or trying to intercept a one-way attack drone, it is entirely possible that debris, shrapnel, or a direct hit could have caused catastrophic damage. Engines can ingest debris. Rotor systems can be struck by fragments from something exploding nearby. But none of that requires a sophisticated air defense system. It only requires being close to something that explodes. At the same time, this incident happened near the coast of Oman, which sits on the opposite side of the strait from Iran. That is a detail worth sitting with, because Iran's demonstrated capability throughout this conflict had largely been concentrated closer to its own coastline, where its mine-laying efforts and fast boat patrols were most active. Whether Iranian forces had assets capable of reaching an aircraft that far from their own shore is a fair question, and it's one that only the ongoing investigation can ultimately answer. What is not in question, what every official source agrees on, is what happened after the crash. 2 American soldiers were now in the water, at night. Inside what may be the single most contested stretch of ocean on the planet at that moment in time. Iranian fast attack boats, sea mines, unmanned underwater vehicles. A regime that had, just hours earlier, vowed to strike back at American forces in the region. Every single one of those things was somewhere in that same water. In a conventional rescue scenario, this is the moment where risk multiplies fast. You send a helicopter to pull your people out, and now you have a second aircraft flying low and slow directly into the same threat environment that brought down the first one. You send a boat full of sailors, and now you've put more Americans directly in harm's way, in exactly the kind of contested water that Iran had spent months trying to control. Every asset you commit to the rescue becomes a second potential target. That is the brutal math of combat search and rescue, and it has held true for as long as air power has existed. But this time, the United States had another option. And it is an option that, until this week, had never actually been used this way in the history of the American military. Enter Task Force 59. If that name means nothing to you, you are not alone. Task Force 59 is not a household name, not like SEAL Team 6 or the 82nd Airborne. It is the U.S. Navy's dedicated unmanned and artificial intelligence task force, run out of the 5th Fleet headquarters in Bahrain. Its entire mission, since its creation, has been to quietly build out a network of unmanned systems across the waters of the Middle East. Not headline-grabbing weapons platforms, but a patient, distributed web of robotic sensors, surface vessels, and underwater systems designed to watch, track, and eventually act across some of the most contested maritime space in the world. According to CENTCOM, it was an unmanned surface vessel attached to Task Force 59, specifically identified in official Navy imagery as an Arabian Fox Mast 13 unmanned surface vessel that conducted the rescue of the 2 Apache crew members. Multiple outlets, including the specialist defense publication The War Zone, along with major networks like ABC News, confirmed that U.S. officials were describing this as the first known instance of an unmanned surface drone being used to successfully carry out a personnel rescue at sea. Not the first time in this conflict. The first time, full stop, in the history of American military operations. Think about what that actually means, mechanically and strategically. Instead of sending a manned helicopter or crewed boat back into the same dangerous water that had just claimed one aircraft, the United States sent a machine. No pilot risked, no sailors exposed, just a drone boat operating in exactly the kind of environment Task Force 59 had spent years preparing for, moving through contested water, locating 2 Americans in the dark and bringing them home, all without putting a single additional service member's life on the line to do it. CENTCOM's own statement said the soldiers were, quote, safely rescued within approximately 2 hours and are in stable condition. 2 hours. In open water, at night, in a strait ringed by fast attack craft, mines, and a regime that had spent the previous day promising retaliation. And the asset that found them and got them out did not need to breathe, did not need body armor, and could not be taken hostage. That last point is worth sitting with for a moment because it may be one of the most strategically significant parts of this entire story, even if it is the part that gets the least attention. Throughout this conflict, and in the broader history of tensions between the United States and Iran, captured American personnel have represented enormous strategic value to Tehran. A downed and captured pilot, or a soldier pulled from the water by Iranian forces rather than American ones, becomes leverage. It becomes a bargaining chip in any negotiation, a propaganda opportunity, a way to shape the narrative of a conflict entirely in Iran's favor. The fact that an autonomous system reached those two soldiers before anyone else could is not just a technical achievement. It is a story about denying an adversary a strategic win they would have very much wanted. Now, it is important to be precise about what has and has not been confirmed regarding Task Force 59's broader capabilities, because this is exactly the kind of story where speculation can creep in disguised as fact. What we know from public Navy statements and reporting over the past several years is that Task Force 59 has been experimenting with a range of unmanned systems in the region, including surface vessels used for surveillance and now, as of this week, personnel recovery. The specific technical details of how this particular vessel located the crew, what sensors or AI-assisted tracking systems were involved, and what its full capabilities are, have not been publicly released. What we can say with confidence is limited to what CENTCOM and the Navy have officially confirmed. An unmanned surface vessel found 2 American soldiers in the water and got them home safely, in a first for American military history. So why does any of this matter beyond the 2 men who came home safely that night? Which, to be clear, is the most important outcome of all of this by a wide margin. It matters because it may represent a genuine turning point in how the United States thinks about risk in future rescue operations, particularly in contested maritime environments like the Strait of Hormuz. For decades, the calculation in combat search and rescue has been straightforward and unavoidable. If you want to get your people back, you accept the risk of sending more people in after them. That calculation has just been fundamentally challenged, not eliminated, challenged. Because the same technology that pulled 2 aviators out of the water could, in theory, be extended to other roles. If an unmanned system can locate and recover personnel in contested water, the logical next questions become obvious. Could similar systems be used to track hostile vessels before they threaten shipping? Could they be networked together with other unmanned platforms the Navy has been developing? Could a persistent distributed web of unmanned surface and underwater systems eventually take on a role in directly countering the kind of swarming small boat tactics Iran has relied on throughout this campaign? But to be clear, none of that has been confirmed as current Navy doctrine. And it would be irresponsible to present speculation about future weaponized drone boat swarms as established fact. What can be said, based on the public record, is that Task Force 59 already operates a range of unmanned platforms in the region, and that its mission has always been about expanding the reach and reducing the risk of American operations in exactly this kind of contested water. This week's rescue is the clearest public demonstration yet of that mission actually paying off in a life or death scenario. Now let's talk about the response, because the story did not end with the rescue. In the hours after President Trump's statement that Iran had shot down the helicopter and his declaration that the United States would, of necessity, respond, retaliatory action followed. Reporting confirmed that U.S. forces conducted airstrikes against Iranian targets in the aftermath of the incident, continuing a pattern that had defined much of the broader campaign to keep the Strait of Hormuz open since March of 2026. CENTCOM also confirmed that around the same time, American forces turned away vessels attempting to run the naval blockade that had been imposed on Iran since mid-April, part of the broader pressure campaign that had been building for months. This is the environment the Apache crew was flying in that night, and it is the environment American forces continue to operate in as this story develops. A ceasefire that exists more on paper than in practice. A blockade that Iran has repeatedly tried to challenge using small boats, mines, and drones, the exact threats the Apache and the A-10 had been sent to counter in the first place. And now, a new and previously unproven tool in the American arsenal, a rescue system that does not require risking additional American lives to bring people home. It's worth stepping back and putting this single incident into the context of the broader campaign that had already been underway for months by the time this Apache went down. Since March, American and Allied airstrikes had targeted what officials described as more than 100 Iranian naval vessels, and dozens of vessels used to lay mines in and around the strait. Large bunker-penetrating munitions had reportedly been used against underground storage facilities tied to Iran's naval and drone capabilities. This was not an isolated skirmish. It was one incident inside a much larger, months-long campaign to keep one of the most economically important waterways in the world open against a determined and creative adversary that had built its entire naval strategy around swarming tactics specifically designed to be difficult for conventional forces to counter. And that is really the heart of why this rescue matters so much beyond the human story of two soldiers coming home safely. Iran's strategy in the Strait has never been about winning a conventional naval engagement against the United States Navy. Nobody in Tehran believes that is a fight they can win. Instead, the strategy has been about friction, about making the cost of keeping the Strait open as high and as constant as possible through mines, through small boat harassment, through one-way attack drones, through exactly the kind of low-level, high-frequency threats that eventually wear down even a superior force through sheer persistence and risk exposure. An unmanned rescue capability cuts directly against that strategy. If the primary cost of operating in contested water is the risk to American personnel, and a significant part of that risk can now be absorbed by an unmanned system instead of a human being, that changes the entire calculation Iran has been counting on. It does not eliminate the danger. It does not make the Strait safe, but it does mean that even when things go wrong, even when an aircraft goes down in exactly the kind of scenario Iran has been trying to create, the United States has a way to get its people back that does not require putting more Americans directly in harm's way to do it. That is not a small thing. In the long, difficult history of combat search and rescue operations, from Vietnam through Somalia and Afghanistan and Iraq, the story has always been the same. Getting your people back means accepting risk, sometimes catastrophic risk, to do it. This week, for the first time on record, that story had a different ending. There is still a lot we do not know, and we should be honest about that rather than pretending otherwise. We do not know with full certainty what caused the Apache to go down that night. The investigation into that question was still active in the immediate aftermath, even as the president stated publicly that Iran was responsible. We do not know the full technical details of how Task Force 59's unmanned vessel located the two soldiers in open water at night, because those specifics have not been made public. And we do not know exactly how this capability will be used, expanded, or refined going forward, because that is a decision that has not yet been made in public view. What we do know is this: on the night of June 8th, 2026, an American Apache helicopter went down in some of the most dangerous water on Earth. 2 American soldiers ended up in that water, in the dark, with a hostile coastline close enough to see. And for the first time in the recorded history of the United States military, the rescue that brought them home was carried out not by another manned aircraft, not by a crew of sailors risking their own lives to reach them, but by an unmanned vessel built by a task force most people had never heard of until this week. Both men came home. Both are reported to be safe and in stable condition. That is the outcome that matters most in all of this, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we move on to what it all might mean. Because beyond the headlines about retaliation, beyond the questions still being investigated about exactly what brought that helicopter down, this is fundamentally a story about 2 people who did not have to spend their last hours on Earth wondering if help was coming. Help came. It came from an unlikely place, built by people whose names we will probably never know, working on a program most Americans have never heard of, doing exactly the job it was quietly built to do. Whatever comes next in the Strait of Hormuz, whatever the investigation ultimately determines about the cause of that crash, and whatever the future holds for unmanned systems in American military operations, this much has already been written into the record. When the moment came, when 2 Americans needed to be found in the dark, in contested water, with no time to spare, the machine did not hesitate, and it did not fail. That is where this story stands right now. The investigation continues, the region remains tense, the ceasefire fragile, and the Strait as contested as ever. But 2 families got their loved ones back this week, and they got them back because of a piece of technology that, until a few days ago, had never been asked to do this before and answered the call anyway.